Born September 4th, 1947, we're not going through your whole life. He's an American politician from the state of New Hampshire, it says. Wikipedia, looking up at standard Spanish. He formerly served as Speaker of the New Hampshire House of Representatives. He's a member of the Democratic Party. He serves as a member of the New Hampshire House of Representatives from the Merrimack 11th District. Like myself, he is a Vietnam veteran and a retired Supervisory Deputy U.S. Marshal. I bet you didn't know some of that. But he's a really good guy. And he has held the position with the House as committee chair, minority leader, as well as majority leader. And some of you will remember, he also served 11 years as an at-large member of the Concord City Council. And quite frankly, that's where I first met Steve. My friend Steve, welcome him.
Thank you, John. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I've got cards I've made, but I want to hopefully talk to you more than I read to you. It's so nice seeing all of you, and I'm not going to mention all the friends that are here tonight, but one person I've got to recognize is Dr. Richard Hesse, Professor Richard Hesse, Professor Emeritus from UNH Law. I have been to at least 10 or 11 of his lectures on John Winant, including driving over to Claremont one night because he was speaking there. I guess I am his only groupie, but... Oh, there's more? Oh, this is... I feel like a pupil of Aristotle telling the master why he's wrong. So, but without further ado, it's always good to see him, Professor Hesse and his wife, and so many more good friends from the legislature and from all over. Let me get started. John Winant. We'll start on November 4th, 1930. John Winant just got elected to his second non-consecutive term as governor of New Hampshire. And at that time, the state of New Hampshire was in the grip of the Great Depression. Both our state and our country were suffering. In Washington, Herbert Hoover was the president, and he seemed to do little, or very little, to help those millions of people that now found themselves out of work. And if you read about Hoover, you'll find a lot of reasons given for his inactivity. Personally, I think it has to do a lot with his own life experiences. Hoover grew up in Iowa. His dad, a blacksmith, died when Hoover was only 6 years old. He had a heart attack. 3 years later, his mother died of typhoid fever. And Hoover went to live with an uncle in California. At 13, Hoover quit school to go to work. At 17, never having attended high school, he took the entrance exam for Stanford University, passed it, and went on to earn a degree in geology and be a very successful mining engineer. Well, because of the inactivity of the federal government, it put more pressure on the state governments to provide for those in need. And John Winant did that immediately. Working with the state legislature, he got 4 very important bills passed. One bill allowed him to reform the State Banking Commission. Another bill allowed him to increase the minimum wage for women and children. Another bill increased the funding for our state highway programs, which not only improved our infrastructure, but it also provided jobs. And lastly, he started a program that is actually still with us today. He got the legislature to pass a bill creating a commission on arts and crafts, the only state in the nation at that time to do it. John Winant was a strong proponent of those at home that weren't outside the house to start selling those things that they always made and gave to gifts to friends and families. The sweaters they knit, mittens, scarves, jams and jellies, and in home crafts. A year later, this commission, called the Commission on Arts and Crafts, became what is today the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, and this all goes back to Governor Winant. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency, defeating Herbert Hoover. And Hoover took 6 states, including New Hampshire, by less than 1% of the vote. John Winant won his 3rd and final term as governor. Now, Roosevelt and Winant were friends. They were on the National Governors Association. They both had been trustees of the prep school in Holderness, New Hampshire. And they also shared a political philosophy. They were adherents to the philosophy of Senator Lafayette and Teddy Roosevelt and that progressive movement. Although Roosevelt was a pragmatic progressive, with John Winant was very idealistic. And years later, when he went to work in the Roosevelt administration, the president gave him the nickname of Utopian John because of his philosophies. In 1933, the textile workers at the Amoskeag Mill went out on strike. And Governor Winant, with a lot of help from the Roman Catholic Bishop of New Hampshire, Bishop William Peterson, quickly brought the strike to an end to get the workers back in the mills. A year later, on September 1st, 1934, the textile workers at a textile mill in Alabama went on strike. Within a matter of a couple of days, over 400,000 members of the Textile Workers Union were on strike and on the picket line. President Roosevelt appointed Winant to chair a 3-person commission, excuse me, called the Commission on Inquiry and Arbitration, along with 2 others. Their goal was to end the strike and get those people back to work, especially during the Depression. On September 22nd, that commission brought labor and management together, and the strike ended. Then there was a lot of talk in the media. Oh, bless you, my child. A lot of talk in the media about John Winant and the wonderful job he did, and the fact that one columnist called him the Abe Lincoln of New Hampshire. Everybody was talking about Winant as a Republican candidate in '36 against Hoover. Well, everybody but John Winant. A few months later, President Roosevelt asked Winant if he would go to Switzerland, to Geneva, to be the deputy chair of the International Labor Organization. And Frances Perkins, the first woman to serve in the presidential cabinet as Secretary of Labor, asked Roosevelt, did you actually send him to Switzerland to get him out of the '36 election? And the president, fumbling with papers on his desk, said, no, John Winant was the best man. But a few years later, Roosevelt gave an off-the-cuff to reporters, not for publication. And they were talking about the 1940 election, and they asked Roosevelt, who do you think's going to run? And Roosevelt said, I got a short list of Republicans that I think are qualified to be president. And he said, give us names. He said, I'll give you one name, and that's John Winant from New Hampshire. That was the respect he had. So John Winant was now off to Geneva to be a member of the ILO. Winant was the first American appointed to the International Labor Organization. Now, the ILO was created in 1918. It was part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. And its mission was to improve the social and working conditions of people around the world. Wilson didn't have a chance to appoint anybody. He was so devastated that Congress defeated his dream that the United States join the League of Nations. And neither Harding or Coolidge or Hoover would ever send anybody to the ILO because there was this wave of isolationism now sweeping across America. And in fact, the author, Ernest Hemingway, himself a World War I veteran who was wounded in Italy as an ambulance driver and received a Silver Star from the Italian government, wrote, we were dragged into the First World War, into the Great War in Europe, we would be foolish to allow ourselves to be dragged into another European war. And that was the feeling. And that feeling somewhat, I believe, affected Roosevelt and a lot of his thoughts and a lot of the things he did, because he knew there was this group out there that wanted us doing nothing. Well, John Winant was off to Switzerland, and he was there for less than 4 months when the president called him back and asked him to serve as the first director of Social Security. Now, as you know, our numbers in New Hampshire begin 001, 002, 003. Those numbers were supposed to go to the state of Maine. But the new folks at Social Security said, well, we want to give John Winant the very lowest number possible. So those numbers came to New Hampshire. And they said, Governor, we got a surprise for you. Look at the Social Security number you're going to have. Of course, being a modest guy, he says, I don't want it. Oh. So if you're ever on Jeopardy, and the final Jeopardy question is, what is 01, 001, 0001? The correct question is, who was Mrs. Grace Owen of 51 South Street here in Concord? Social Security number. Grace got it. So, and don't forget where you got the answer. So anyway, Social Security passed Congress. It passed the House on a vote of 372 to 23. And in the Senate, it passed 77 to 6. Overwhelming bipartisan support for Social Security. So what could happen to Social Security? Well, what happened was the 1936 presidential election. The Republicans decided to make Social Security one of their campaign issues against the re-election of Roosevelt. And their nominee that year was Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, another progressive, close friend to Governor Winant's. And Winant had talked a lot to Landon about the successes and how important Social Security was. And he was heartbroken and devastated when Governor Landon lost control of his campaign. It wasn't being run out of Kansas, it was being run out of DC by the Republican Party, and they gave him his talking points. And he'd go on the stump and say, Social Security is nothing but a Ponzi scheme. You people giving 1% of your salary into Social Security, if Roosevelt's elected, you're never going to see that money again. If Roosevelt's elected, he's going to sweep the Social Security Trust Fund and put that money into New Deal programs. And John Winant was livid. He felt betrayed, first of all, by Landon, because they had talked and he had told him how successful. And then Landon did the act that drove the governor over the edge. In a speech, he said, when I'm elected president, the very first thing I'm going to do is repeal Social Security. Well, that was the last straw for John Winant. He went to the White House. He told President Roosevelt, I'm stepping down from Social Security. I'm going to campaign for you. I'm going to go out on the stump. But he said, I'm really doing is, I just want to tell the truth about Social Security. And from August of 36 till November, that's what he did. In fact, he even gave one nationwide speech on the radio about the positivity of Social Security. And President Roosevelt said, John, don't do it. You'll never get elected to anything again. Your political career will be over. And Winant said, it's something I've got to do. And of course, and Roosevelt knew he had the election sewed up. He won all but 2 states, Vermont and Maine, and immediately put Winant back in Social Security. From what I can see, President Roosevelt never forgot a grudge, but he never forgot an act of kindness. And what Winant had done for him really, I think, made more to him than even he realized. Then he asked Governor Winant, will you go back to the International Labor Organization, this time as his chair? And Winant said, yeah. One thing Winant did when he got there, he moved the International Labor Organization from Geneva, Switzerland to Montreal, Canada. And he did that for two reasons. First and foremost to him, he had a lot of Jewish employees working for the ILO in Switzerland. He'd seen Nazi Germany already invade 3 neutral countries, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. He was so afraid that in 1940 that they would also invade Switzerland, and he was concerned about their well-being. The other issue that concerned him is the ILO was now in an island. They're in Switzerland, but surrounded by fascist countries, and their support came from democracies. Italy on one side, Germany on another, and occupied France on another. So he went to Montreal. And in that position, he made a lot of friends, especially in the labor movement around the world, and especially in England. In the spring of 1937, President Roosevelt appointed Joe Kennedy as the ambassador to England. And Joe Kennedy did not particularly care for the British. Now, I'm the son of an Irish immigrant, dual citizenship of the Republic, member of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. I know it's in our Irish DNA to have a little bit of a grudge against the British. It just happens. But that wasn't Joe Kennedy's thing. It wasn't Irish Anglo history that upset him. He was a businessman. And in my way of looking, he was picking winners and losers. And as far as he was concerned, England was going to lose. When Germany finally declared war on Germany on September 1st of 1939, Kennedy told the White House, do not give them anything. You'll never get it back. It's going to be gone. Don't help them at all. And the other thing he would do, he was in his cables, was always get a little shot in at Winston Churchill. And I think he partially did that because Roosevelt told him he didn't particularly care for Churchill. In early November of 1918, President Roosevelt was then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he was in London for a conference. And there was a dinner one night at the Gray's Inn, and Roosevelt got there early, as before he had polio, and he worked the room, and people liked him, and it was going great for him. Then Winston Churchill walked in. Churchill was now in his 5th cabinet position. He was Minister of Munitions, and everybody flocked to Churchill. He was now the center of attention, and he had 2 egos buttoned. Finally, Roosevelt walked over to Churchill to introduce himself and said, I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I'm, Franklin Roosevelt. And Churchill said, well, that's nice. And with that, he turned and walked away and talked to somebody else. And Roosevelt thought I'd been snubbed. Fast forwarding after that incident to the late 1920s, Churchill was in the United States on a book tour. And he sent a note to now Governor Roosevelt saying, I'd like to meet with you to talk about world affairs. And Roosevelt wrote back just a couple of lines and said, I'm terribly sorry, I'm much too busy. I mean, he didn't forget that snub. But they later became friends, and they worked well together. Churchill was a great politician. He was very deferential to the president. But that relation had its ups and downs, too. In December of 1940, Kennedy announced he was stepping down as the ambassador and leaving. And now there's a vacancy. John Winant was in Montreal. Roosevelt had him come down to the White House. He just wanted to talk to him about European affairs and what was happening. In some respects, he was almost Roosevelt's eyes and ears in Europe. And that was the end of the conversation, and Winant went back to Canada. And then Winant was reading, I think, in the New York Times in February, Roosevelt appoints Winant ambassador to England. And apparently FDR had this habit of never telling people they're being considered for anything. They'd read it in Washington Post or the New York Times, Concord Monitor. And that's how we found out he was going to England. He arrived in Bristol, England on March 3rd of 1940. And there to meet him was the Duke of Kent, King George VI's brother. And the media asked Governor Winant to say a few words. And he said, "I am so glad to be here. At this point in time, there is no place I would rather be than here in England." And that was the headlines the next day in all the papers in England. And with those few words, it was love at first sight for the British people and John Winant. That meant so much to him. After they left the airport at Bristol, they took the Royal train, the Duke of Kent and John Winant, and they went to Windsor. And they are standing on the platform at Windsor as King George VI to welcome Winant. And that was extraordinary to have that happen. The protocol always was that any new ambassador would go through the foreign ministry that set up an appointment with the king, and you'd have what they call the presentation, where you'd show your credentials and be welcome. That happened to Winant on March 13th. He went through that. But to have the King of England standing on a railroad platform, can't wait to welcome you to England. It said a lot about Winant, and it said a lot about how much they needed America at that time. John Winant did some things different than Joe Kennedy. First of all, he didn't want to live in the ambassador's residence. It was too opulent for him. So he got a small 3-bedroom flat within walking distance to the embassy. The other thing he did is he decided he was going to have the same rations as the British people instead of the food that was flown in for him in the embassy. He was going to show them his solidarity with them. Now, the U.S. had a ration program during World War II. It was nothing like Britain. They didn't have rations for gasoline or cars. That was out. The rations that John Winant was on was like 2 ounces of butter a week, 4 ounces of margarine, 4 ounces of loose tea, 1 egg a week, sometimes 1 egg every 2 weeks. It was really a Spartan diet. In fact, they talk about people in England having raffles, and what they'd raffle is somebody would raffle off onions, and women waiting in line for up to an hour to buy a pound of potatoes. Somebody once wrote that very few people in England went to bed at night that weren't hungry. It was so tough on them. But John Winant wanted to show he was with them. The other thing John Winant did, which was opposite of Joe Kennedy, when the Blitz started in late 1939, Kennedy got a house, a beautiful home out in Windsor to get out of London during the bombing. What John Winant would do when the Blitz would start, and let me just say about the Blitz, 40,000 Londoners died during the Blitz. It's like the city of Concord just being gone. It was terrifying, especially on nights with full moons. They know the German bombers would be coming. Winant would go out and he'd ask the fire brigades, "Can I help you?" Either take bodies out of the rubble or whatever he could do to help. Then he'd walk down through the subway system where the common British people would go during the bombings. And they were scared. And the U.S. still wasn't in the war. But he'd walk down through those subways whenever there was a bombing, and he'd talk to the people. And he'd tell them everything was going to be okay. And that meant so much to the British people. That was John Winant. On December 7th, he was at Chequers with Winston Churchill, where he went almost every weekend. He was with Churchill. And they were listening to the BBC after dinner, and they broke in with the news that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. And Churchill started to run out of the room, and Winant said, "Where are you going?" He goes, "I'm going to go declare war on Japan." He said, "Don't you think you should confirm that first before you actually declare war on another country?" So Churchill came back. I want to tell you about one thing that I think was probably one of John Winant's finest moments, I think, when he was in England. When the war with Germany started in September of '39, the British government imposed some regulations that really had the power of law. and one of them was unions could not strike. If they had a complaint, they'd go to arbitration, but it was binding arbitration. Whatever the arbitrator ruled, that was it. And businesses really took advantage of this, especially the mine owners. And the mines, safety had suffered. They weren't putting as much into it. They were working out longer hours with the same low pay, and their quotas were increased. And in the summer of '42, miners in Durham went on strike. And the reason they went on strike, a mine owner up there had mine number 1, and he closed it, and he opened mine number 2. And all of a sudden, the amount of coal being produced by that mine dropped. And the miners blamed the union members, saying, it's a work slowdown. You're purposely not mining as much coal as you did before. And one thing to consider is these miners are actually older than they normally would have been. A lot of the younger men weren't even going back into the mines before the war. Why do I want to go a half a mile underground, 7 hours a day, 8 hours a day in the dark with a pick, crouched over, standing in water to end up dying of black lung like my father or my grandfather? And then when the war came, those that would have gone into the mines went into the service. And the miners said, no, we are not slowing down work. When you put that coal face in mine number 2, it's too narrow, it's too small. We can't work it. And they went to arbitration, and the arbitrator said, yeah, you're slowing down, speed it up, and and that was the end of it. The miners said, the hell with it. We're going on strike. We've had enough. No more. The miners were going to hold a meeting in Durham, England, to vote to keep that strike going. They had representatives, 400 representatives representing the 4,000 members of the miners' union. And the miners were very upset, not only for the conditions, but after they went on strike, the 3 leaders of the miners' union were arrested. 1,085 miners were actually fined for not reporting to work. So Clement Attlee, who was the deputy prime minister and also the head of the Labour Party, but part of Churchill's coalition government, asked John Winant if he would go to Durham and try to talk the miners into going back to work, because coal was so critical to the war effort, especially for the factories. So Winant took the train up to Durham. And you probably heard that John Winant wasn't always a very good speaker. He had problems, and he'd stop and start. And that day he gave a wonderful speech. And I don't know it verbatim, but he talked to him about the fact that right now, everything we're doing to get production out for airplanes and for tanks and ships, that now must be focused after the war on providing jobs and housing and education with that same exuberance. And you men down in the mines, you are just as important to this war effort as the boys on the front lines, our sons. And he went on in that vein, and his speech just overwhelmed the miners. And when Winant finished and left, the miners met, and they voted to go back to work. And so that ended the strike. The next day in the papers, the headlines was, Winant ends coal strike. Another one had, the Americans have the Lincoln Gettysburg Address. We have John Winant's Durham Address. And another newspaper headline or story was, it should be mandatory for every British child to memorize John Winant's Durham speech. It was so heartfelt by the miners. And over the next couple, I don't want to keep you too much later than I have to, we ended up with 1.3 million soldiers in the U.S. before the invasion on June 6th, the Normandy invasion. And that in itself was a challenge for John Winant. One thing he got changed was to allow American soldiers, if they committed any crime, they would be punished by the military. They go through the military justice system instead of the British. And he did that after he read in a newspaper where a soldier had done something, and his punishment was to be given 15 lashes. So, being somewhat draconian. So, he did so much in that time during the war. The relationship between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill seemed to suffer a bit. It was, instead of being equals, with Roosevelt being the first among equals, Churchill started to feel that he was more of a junior partner in this arrangement with Roosevelt. It was a tough time. Let me just take a minute to talk briefly about the two women in John Winant's life. First was his wife, Constance Russell. They were married in December of 1919. They were supposed to be married in the spring of the following year, but her father, Mr. Russell, died in November. And so instead of having a lavish wedding, they had a small wedding at the Episcopal Church in Princeton. When her father died, he left her $750,000, which would now be the equivalent of $11 million. She was extremely wealthy. And she traveled in a different style than John Winant. And I think they genuinely loved each other. They did. But like married singles, going their own direction. She was very active in raising dogs. She won the Westminster Best of Show twice, in 42 and 50 with terriers. That was her thing. And if you go to the Winant, where the home was by the Unitarian Church, and drive up that first driveway, you can still see part of her old kennels are still there. But she traveled in a different circle than the governor. And the governor was a quiet, shy, somewhat introverted man. He'd rather talk to a laborer than he would to a duke or an earl. It was just a different relationship. Every weekend, as I mentioned, he'd go to Chequers or wherever the prime minister was spending the weekend. And there he met Sarah Churchill, who was said to be Churchill's favorite child and his second daughter. She was married in 1936 to a radio. This must have really impressed the family. She told the folks in 36, I'm getting married. Oh, who are you marrying? Well, he's a radio comedian from Switzerland. Oh, and he's Jewish. A nice Jewish kid. Oh, well, they weren't happy. They wanted him to meet somebody in their circle. In 5 years, they knew that marriage was over. He had a drinking problem, her husband, Vic Oliver, and he was seeing other women. And so Sarah Churchill went to her dad and said, I want to get a divorce. This isn't working. This is in 41. And he said, please don't do it till after the war. It'll hurt the country's morale to see you getting divorced. And because of the love of her father, she said, okay. So her and Governor Winant began a relationship. And he was 24 years older than her. She was born in 1924. And, but it seemed to be they generally cared for each other. And as we're moving closer to the end of the war, he asked her to marry him. And she said, listen, I'm still married. You're married. I don't want to, please, let's not even talk about it. And we're moving closer. April 10th, rather, President Roosevelt died. That changed things dramatically. Now Harry Truman was president. And the governor didn't really know Truman, and Truman didn't know Winant. Truman didn't know Churchill, and Churchill didn't know Truman, and that was a big issue. And then on May 17th, Germany surrendered. Then in August, Clement Attlee left the coalition government. There was a general election. Churchill lost his seat, which surprised everybody. But people, they wanted a change. And they felt Attlee, as leader of the Labor Party, was promising a lot of things, public housing and things for education. And I think the British people felt they were owed something for what they went through. John Winant he always thought, and Roosevelt talked about him being the first Secretary General of the United Nations. And then when Roosevelt died, he knew that wasn't going to happen. And when the Rockefeller brothers gave the land for the UN on the East River, he knew that thought was gone. That wasn't going to go. The new Secretary of State, George Marshall, came up with the Marshall Plan. He wanted to be the director of that. That didn't happen. I said John Winant, I think I said John Winant gave 2 great speeches in his life. The one was in Durham. The other one was in 1946. Congress had a joint session of the House and Senate, and they invited John Winant to give the eulogy. And Eleanor Roosevelt told him, there's nobody I'd rather have speak about my husband than you. So he came back to the States then he went back to England on April, I think it was April 10th of 1946. He resigned his position. He was given a position with UNESCO, but it was really a step down for him. Mifflin, the publishers, gave him a contract to write 3 books about his life in Europe and during the war. And he finished Letters from Grosvenor Square, which was published the day after he died. But he hated doing it. And he asked Sarah Churchill once again, will you please, let's get married. And she said no. He says, I'm divorced now, you're still married, a little shot there. But she really wanted, and she loved the guy. And she wrote letters to her father, and he knew what was going on and how much she cared for him. But she just didn't want to get into that involvement. On the King's birthday list for January of 1947, Winant was to be awarded the Medal of Merit, which was given by King George. Only he and Dwight Eisenhower have ever been the only 2 Americans that have ever received it. In fact, Churchill said, the only medal I ever want from the British government is the Order of Merit. It meant so much. He received that, and things were really going downhill for him. I think he was physically, mentally, emotionally, and financially exhausted. He had no money. He went back to the States on November 2nd. He had dinner late and then went to bed, and then walked into his son's bedroom, looking out what the great author Lynn Olson called the Bow Hills. I always thought of them as Silver Hills. He shot himself and died. His dream was to be, or his hope was to be buried at St. Paul's. But the Episcopal Church, like my faith, Catholicism, if you took your life, you were in a state of sin and couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. So he's buried at Blossom Hill. This past week, I've heard about him so much being buried at Blossom Hill. I went to the cemetery office, and those women are terrific. And I said to him, do you happen to know where John Winant was buried here in November of 1947? And she gave me a wonderful map. She dug all this paperwork out and got it. And I went and saw where his grave was. You can see the indentation. There's nobody been buried there. This is it. But finally, he got back to St. Paul's, which I think was really, that was his family. But one thing I saw in the paperwork, that the order to remove his body from Blossom Hill was signed by his wife. So I've often wondered, was there friction or the tension? But to have her go and sign those papers to say, yes, please move his body from Blossom Hill to where he really wants to be, showed me that she still had that caring for him, even though she was married twice after he died. Both husbands of hers died, and she's now buried in Arlington with her second husband. That concludes what I want to say. I just want to talk a little bit about the Winant Memorial for just a couple of minutes. I grew up in Concord. My mom and dad were lifelong Franklin Roosevelt Democrats. I remember my mother was going to vote for Eisenhower in one election, and my folks never talked politics. And my mother had said in '56, I think I'm going to vote for Ike. And my dad said, have you forgotten what Franklin Roosevelt did for us during the Depression? You go, yeah, you're right, Charlie. I guess I'll vote for Stevenson. But the one other Republican they always spoke with great admiration was John Winant, and how good he was, and how much he did during the Depression. And my mother, who was actually more Catholic than the Pope, would always mention, oh, he sold the beautiful land to the Carmelite monastery, the Carmelite nuns for their monastery at far below market price. Such a good man. And then I read Lynn Olson's book, and I said, gee, why haven't we done something? So I put a bill in the legislature to have a study committee look at the possibility of having a statue here in Concord paid by private donations, not state money. And in the first meeting we had, Van McLeod showed up. And I knew Van from a library board. I was on with him at one time. But he was the spark plug. I was a chair, but I was like the third wheel, I think. But Van had such determination and such spirits. And at first, the donations came in fairly well. We got a $50,000 donation from the U.S. ambassador in London, Mr. Bazin, who went to St. Paul's. And we said, this is going to be so easy. Well, after about the third year, we say, oh, this isn't working. But, Van, every one of our meetings, he'd say, no, upward and onward, we're going to do this. And without his spirit and his determination, we wouldn't have created the Winant Memorial. And he died before the dedication. I know he was there with us, and thank you, Van. Well, that's my presentation. Any questions, I'd be glad to answer them if I can. I just hope the first question is, why don't you speak for 15 minutes and do 45 minutes of questions? But if there are any questions, and I'm not an expert. We have one with us, but it's not me. So if there are any, I'd be glad to answer them. Yes?
Where exactly was the house and the property?
In Concord?
Yeah.
It's right with the Unitarian churches on Pleasant Street. And he left it as an orphanage, and the state eventually sold it, and then it was sold to the Unitarian Church, and a beautiful home. Jim had been to the old Winant home.
Oh, yes, I was as a child. They turned it into a part of the state hospital and mental health studies. And there were programs going on there learning about children and how they interact and so forth. And I was selected to be one of those children. And I remember very, very well. Beautiful building and for a good purpose. But then the Unitarian
Church bought it.
And the only thing left, I guess,
is part of that kennel.
The kennels in the back.
Yeah.
I haven't seen them yet.
Yes, ma'am.
Didn't he turn over land that became the Winant Trail?
His son, Rivington, was willed that land, 85 acres behind the house. In Rivington, Winant, Bill Gardner told me this at the dedication of his memorial, and Rivington had passed on, and Rivington went on to be the treasurer of the United Nations, a very prominent position. But Bill Gardner told me that Rivington had told him, my father will never receive the recognition he deserves because of the way he died. And so for us, that made the memorial that much more special. Yes?
I think that Lynn Olson book made a big difference.
Yeah, it really did. There was a couple of people, when I put the bill in.
Did you hear her question?
I just want to finish up on this one here. When I put the bill in the House, I had to put in two bills. First to the study committee, then a bill to allow it to go on the grounds of the state library. And there were some people that thought John Winant was too much of the progressive, and they said, oh, why don't you put it out at Winant Park? And that wouldn't have worked, but it's a beautiful park. Yes, Karen?
Steve, what drew you to do all the research on this particular person? I mean, your presentation was wonderful. I hope.
Well, Professor Hesse, for one.
Well, I mean, did you take a course?
No.
And just go
Just read a lot.
down this path? Or
Well, like I said, a lot of it was my folks. My grandmother lived in Hopkinton, and we'd go out Pleasant Street going to Hopkinton, And there'd always be a comment scene when we went by the governor, where his house was, you know, oh, poor John Winant, what a wonderful man. And of course, he died broke. He had nothing. And I remember my dad telling me, Mr. King was a chauffeur for Governor Winant. And when Governor Winant, of course, he took his life, but shortly after that, the Monitor had an article about John Winant's will. And my dad said that the paper said that Mr. King, his chauffeur for many years, was left $5,000 by Governor Winant. And my dad saw him after Mass one Sunday, and he said, gee, congratulations on that money. That was good of the governor to leave it to you. And Mr. King, I can't remember his first name, but my dad said, Mr. King told him, he said, Charlie, Governor Winant didn't have any money. He was broke. All that stuff you saw, what he left, he had nothing. And of course he was $500,000 in debt, which would be close to $6 million now. But hearing my folks talk about it, and of course, you know, reading Lynn Olson's book, and my dream is to win Powerball and then finally have the John Winant make a movie out of her book. But yeah, but anyway, thank you for asking. Yes?
What's behind that part of the statue of Winant where he's holding the hand out and people are putting money in there? What is the genesis of that?
Well, during the Depression, there's a lot of little things about that statue that mean a lot. One of them is his hand, like he used to give the people unemployed that sit on that wall that faces now the State House Annex, which wasn't there. It was a beautiful, in fact, I think it was and I can't remember now, it was a beautiful home there. And they'd sit there because that's where the sun would come in and the wall would kind of keep them warm. And he'd give them $50. And he used to tell, here in Concord, he'd tell the police department, he'd get somebody who's homeless, you know, bring him into the station, let him sleep in a cell, buy him breakfast in the morning, and send me the bill. And they tell one other story about Governor Winant. He came into a meeting one time, middle of winter, and he walked in and he didn't have a top coat on. And they said, Governor, where's your coat? It's cold out there. He said, well, I met a fella outside on the wall that needed it more than I did. But that was, yeah, and that wall around the memorial symbolizes that wall on the south side of the State House where the homeless would sit, and he'd talk to them and help them. So, yes?
Did he ever consider running for Congress when he came back in 47?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know, Professor Hesse, I've never heard of him talking. He did think in 1926, was it, that he kind of hemmed and hawed about a senatorial or congressional run, and he hemmed and hawed so long he didn't file for governor, and that's why he kind of sat out that 2-year period. But there was a lot of talk about him running, being the Republican candidate in 36 for the things he had done. But he didn't seem to have that interest. You know, I don't know. Supposedly at one time, Roosevelt told him he thought about him as being his Secretary of State also, instead of Marshall. But you know, that didn't happen. It's like all of a sudden everything just kind of went haywire for him. And one other story I should tell you too is about his son John Jr., which brought a lot of stress to him. He was an Army Air Corps pilot, and he was shot down over Germany in 1943. And eventually he was put into a POW camp there was a name for it, but it's VIPs. So at the end of the war, maybe they could be pawns and make a deal. And after towards the end, in May of 45, when the war was about to end, Himmler ordered this German general to take these detainees, including John Jr., and take them out and shoot them. He said, why should the king and queen of England be smiling and laughing while our families in Germany are crying? Go ahead and shoot him. And this general, being no dummy, said, wait a minute, the war's almost over. This isn't going to look good for me. And they ended up being able to go to Austria, and Winant got the word. And when Winant's son was captured, you know, he was upset, and he tended to be depressing at times. But he gets such a warmth from the British people. And they're saying, like, we're not with you because you're the American ambassador. You're one of us. and we're feeling this pain too. But there's a long answer to a short question. Yes, ma'am.
So you said that now only the kennels survive. What happened to the house? Why did
Well, he wanted it to be an orphanage for children, and it went to the state, and then the state used it for a while, and then they sold it to the Unitarian Church, and they tore it down to build their church. Yeah.
Oh, so the church is actually where the house was?
Exactly where the house is. Yeah.
But they didn't tear down the kennel?
No, I think they may use it for storage. It looks like an old garage, actually. So they may use it for, I don't know, lawnmowers or whatever. Seeing nothing, you're all free to go. But thank you all so much. Oh.